Aisha, his young wife, his child bride, who I believe married when she was 9, though he had possession of her when she was 6, what we would call, then it would be normal. Oh, I'm a Muslim man, I'm 30, I'm 40, and I'm going to marry a 9-year-old. You can have 4 wives and as many slaves as you want, concubines. And they talk about how they attacked and killed everyone, and they took a nun and ganged her until she died in front of everyone. And the eyewitness says, and the Turks did this often to pilgrims. Jihad of the pen, jihad of the tongue, jihad of the money, jihad of the womb. And all of them are to serve Islam, to empower it over infidels. And a Muslim is one who submits. But if you really went to it, it was a political thing. I'm superior, I'm the warlord, you're joining me, you're submitting to me in what I say, which comes from God. And that was it. He claims he's from God, but his modus operandi, the way he behaves, is all about violence, warfare, plunder, sexuality, concubinage, etc. England, it's reached the point where you can't even say the truth about what's happening without going to jail. So obviously the rulers of England, whether they are British natives, hate and are warring on their own people.
Raymond Ibrahim is an American author, historian, and public speaker. He was born in the United States to Coptic Christian parents from Egypt. Ibrahim holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history from California State University, Fresno, with a focus on Islamic and Middle Eastern history. He also studied at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. From 2006 to 2010, he worked as an Arabic language researcher at the Library of Congress. He is an author of 4 books: The Al-Qaeda Reader,
Crucified Again,
Sword and Scimitar, which we have right here, and the newest book is The Defenders of the West. Correct? Yeah, Defenders of the West. Raymond speaks 3 languages: English, Arabic, and Greek. His language skills, particularly in Arabic, have played a central role in his work, especially in translating jihadist texts for his book, The Al-Qaeda Reader. His writings have appeared in various publications, including the Middle East Quarterly, National Review, and the Washington Times. He's a frequent guest on media outlets and has delivered lectures and briefings to government and academic institutions. Mr. Ibrahim is a man of God. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Apollo. Very good to be with you.
So, a quick story of mine. So, just as I told you, I was baptized when I was only 6 months old, and I was baptized to this name Apollinarius, which is Apollo. So, I'm 37 years old. For 35 years, I was an atheist. Though I was baptized, my family has never been religious. We always celebrated Easter and Christmas, but I knew that this has something to do with Jesus, but nothing more. Once I came here to the US, I was like, so Christianity is not about being a Catholic. So that you don't recognize here in the US papacy, the Pope, it means nothing to you. You only read Scripture, and if it's written in the Scripture, it means this is the truth. So no traditions of Catholics or Orthodox. So the main reason I'm here sitting right in front of you is because I am from Lithuania. So my country is a very old country. So the first time Lithuania is mentioned in the history is 1009th year, right? So my country has become a Christian country. The country was baptized, I want to say, in 1387. And since from my childhood, I remember in the school I was taught like, this great duke, he baptized our country, he became a king, and etc. And I was like, why? And I always wanted to know how and what were the terms and conditions of getting baptized as a whole, as a country. So today I would love to talk to you about Christianity, Islamism, and the Great Crusades, just like the fourth year book, Defenders of the West, is all about.
Yeah.
So let's set the stage. Let's say we're in the year approximately 33rd year after Jesus Christ was born. So he's being crucified, right? What's the state in the world? So the whole world is basically what? Asia and Europe, right? Middle East. What do we see outside? What kind of world we live in if it's AD 33?
The world is Rome. This is the Roman Empire at the point. The world that is known, that Western civilization traces its heritage to, is Rome, and it is a big chunk of the real world. Of course, you have the Americas, North and South Americas, and you have indigenous peoples living there, but we have no written records of history there, so we can't really trace it. So civilized empire is Rome. Yes, you have the East, you have China, you have India, you have the peoples living there. But the main peoples that we think of, which today would correspond with Middle Eastern people, European people, North Africans, and of course, Europe, even all the way up to Germania and people in the Britons or English people now, all this was Rome. So you really, that's the best way to understand it without, in a simple way. Of course, I'm saying there are other peoples, there are sub-Saharans and so forth, but recorded history is primarily limited to what is the Roman Empire. And so Jesus and the events you're discussing, 33 AD, is squarely situated in that context.
So AD 33, out of 100% of people that live on the earth, let's say that live in the Roman Empire, percentage-wise, how many of them are pagans still?
When Jesus is crucified?
Yes.
All of them, except his
99%.
disciples. Well, yeah.
But Jews, they were...
Oh, I thought you meant Christians.
No.
The Jews are still, of course, you have the Jews in 33 AD, but the followers of Christ are just basically his disciples at the day of his crucifixion, and maybe others, hundreds of others, or whatever the number may be. And you have the Jews. I can't give you a number, but of course the Jews themselves are a very tiny minority and all limited to Judea at the time. So I mean, I would say not even probably a percent, because of the Roman Empire, when you realize it's all of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East.
They're all pagans.
Yeah, like the pagan Romans worshiping your namesake Apollo, and Zeus and all that sort of thing. Well, it's now Roman, but it's the same Greek gods under different names. Saturn and Zeus and so forth. But yeah, all pagans.
So in 610 something happens, right? Prior to 610, what were the major historic events that we can discuss, just to lay the foundation to what happened in 610?
Sure, there's a lot of things going on. Of course, we just mentioned Jesus. It's still the Roman Empire. You have the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD, and then again, I want to say around 112. There's another rebellion from Jews, and then it's completely the diaspora comes at this point where the Jews are completely exiled, and it's completely turned into an absolute Roman territory. So this is another highlight. Then it still remains a pagan time, and this is the great era of persecution of Christians under various Roman emperors, Diocletian, for example, Nero before him at the time of Peter and Paul. And then, you fast forward until you finally, the persecutions continue. Some of the worst actually under Diocletian were in Egypt, which I find interesting because I'm of Egyptian Coptic heritage, and they're still being persecuted. They're still amongst the worst who are persecuted by Muslims till this day. So it's kind of interesting with Egypt, but all throughout the Middle East, or as we would call it today, until the rise of Constantine the Great, and who becomes the first Christian emperor. And even before he becomes Christian, the Edict of Milan, it really introduces religious freedom. So you can be a Christian without being persecuted now, or you can be a pagan. So it's a time of religious toleration under Constantine. And then he also, makes a pivotal move. He moves the Roman Empire, which is important actually to our story, from Rome to the east, to an area, a little Greek settlement that was known as Byzantium, but it was a very well fortified city. So he built his new Nova Roma, New Rome, but we know it today as Constantinople, or rather as Istanbul today.
Turkey.
Yeah. And so that's a very pivotal event. Constantine is very important. During this time, under his leadership, also the Holy Land. Now, so it's been expunged of Jews way earlier, and it's part of the Christian empire of Constantine. And especially under his mother, Helena, is when they find, according to the teachings and the traditions of Catholics and Orthodox, they find the important sites of Christendom, the burial of Christ, where he was resurrected, the site of the crucifixion, and supposedly they find, as it's known throughout history, the true cross, which is supposedly the cross that Christ himself was crucified on. And they build a massive basilica in Jerusalem over all those sites, which becomes known as the Holy Sepulchre, or the Church of the Resurrection. It's a massive complex. Essentially, it's a basilica over all those sites. And it's very important to our story, as we'll see. That's why I mention it. So you have Constantine, Christian persecution ends. Now we're in the 300s. There's a time under Julian the Apostate, who's a descendant of Constantine, I think a nephew, and he becomes emperor and he tries to bring paganism back, but it doesn't work. It's ultimately a failed, and people just now are becoming Christians. So by the the 4th century and the 5th century, Europe and the Middle East is heavily Christian. Egypt and all those countries, the Middle East, Syria, Armenia, of course, is the first Christian nation to adopt the religion formally and officially. But all throughout North Africa, all throughout Europe, paganism dies. Okay, so, and then you fast forward to the time of Muhammad, who's born supposedly in 570 AD. And at this time, what's going on is you have the Christian world, which is still Rome. And but you also have the rise. You've always had Persians, and they were the Zoroastrians. They have their own very distinct, sophisticated culture and philosophy and religion and civilization. And they're warring with Rome. So Christian Rome is at war with Sasanian. That's the name of the empire, Persia, which is a Zoroastrian empire. And they
worshipped fire, right?
Yeah, the Zoroastrians, loosely speaking. But at this point, they may have more of a Manichaean element, which is a sort of a dualism, which also accords with Zoroastrianism, but pagans, essentially, from a Christian point of view, they would be. And they war with the Christian empire, and there's very graphic accounts of they sack Jerusalem, which was, of course, like I said, the pivotal point since Constantine's time of Christendom. And they steal the true cross. There's a lot of big saga about what they did. And then, the emperor Heraclius brings it back.
And at that time, Jerusalem belongs to the Roman Empire.
Yeah, but it gets conquered by the Persians for something like 10 years. And they commit all sorts of atrocities against the Christians and against the churches, et cetera, et cetera. This is the backdrop. This is going on while Muhammad is actually alive and preaching in
Saudi Arabia.
Arabia at the time. And so this is the backdrop. Okay, if you fast forward to the times of when Muhammad now is alive, and he's preaching his message, and 610. He's in Mecca and he's preaching, and he still hasn't done the Hijra in 622, where year 1 of the Islamic calendar. And so I'll stop there.
So 610, and you said 622, right? Why do you think, in your opinion, Islam occurred in the first place? Was it a political move? Why did it occur? And what happened in that period of time?
Sure. And before I answer that, I'll point out something, that there's been this massive attack on the historiography, the traditional historiography of Islam's origins. But I'm more of a traditionalist. In other words, what I'm trying to say is there's people today who will have you believe Muhammad didn't even exist. And they have a whole complete revisionist history, which I reject. And I only say this as a prelude to what I will say. And at the same time, I only accept the bare bone basic understanding of Muhammad's rise. In other words, I can give you the Islamic traditional story, what Muslims believe, or I can tell you what I believe, which is a simplified version. It's a more, it's the bare bone what we need to know about Muhammad.
So we know what Muslims believe in, so I would like to hear
the
your
bare
story.
bone version is there's a man who rose in Arabia during this time that we're talking about, let's say in the early 600s, who said he's a prophet from God. And he basically, his message was a sort of syncretic Christian Jewish message focused on monotheism, which was revolutionary for the Arabians because they were pagans and polytheists. And his career goes, it goes from being outnumbered and weak, and he has no followers, and he just preaches peace, till he gains followers. And the more he becomes stronger, then the more he goes on the offensive, until basically he becomes, and this is the idea of jihad. And this is actually, so the revelations of the Quran as we have it today, is believed to be revealed to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel piecemeal, okay, over various years, and it's put together now. And so based on the circumstances of what Muhammad was experiencing, Gabriel, through Allah, revealed the Quran to him. And like I said, it starts off, just preaching peace, then he becomes strong. And long story short, it ends up preaching war, offensive war against everyone until they submit to Allah and Muhammad. So the word Muslim we say, but in Arabic, Muslim and Islam, they just mean submission. So in its origin, he was really a political leader. He was not a religious leader. To be a Muslim, Islam means submit. Submit to what? Submit to my authority. I'm Muhammad, I'm the ruler, and behind me is Allah, God. So you're submitting to God. That's the hagiographical version, right? And a Muslim is one who submits. So it was a purely political thing. If you actually went down to the time when this was happening. So today, Islamic historiography, or rather hagiography, presents it in a religious terminology. But if you really went to it, it was a political thing. I'm superior, I'm the warlord, you're joining me, you're submitting to me in what I say, which comes from God. And that was it. Nobody cared, in other words, Muhammad didn't care about the condition of the convert's heart. Okay, it was just about political submission.
Submit.
Believe what you want, just do what we say and agree with what we say, which is there's one God, I'm his prophet, and what I say goes. That was it. Okay,
so you, as a Christian, do you believe that our angel Gabriel is the same angel as they say Jibril, right? In Arabic?
Yeah, Jibril, yeah. No, of course. As a Christian, so even the earliest Christians who understood the story of Muhammad and near contemporaries, such as John of Damascus, who was born maybe 70 years after Muhammad's life, they actually believed that it was a demon. Okay, it was a genie. Muhammad himself, according to the Islamic tradition, this Gabriel would come and choke him, and he would have epileptic seizures, and it was violence, and you would embrace and hug him and almost kill him. And Muhammad himself, according to the Islamic record, was afraid of this until he told his wife Khadijah, and she told him, no, that's the angel of God, something like that. So even in the Islamic record, it comes out that this was a strange supernatural being, but then it ends up it's Gabriel.
But it's written in the Quran or in the Hadiths? It's
primarily in the Hadith. Most of what we know about Muhammad's life is the Hadith and the Sirah. The Sirah is the biography by Ibn Ishaq, but also the Hadith. They're very similar. The Hadith is just piecemeal, various sayings and doings of Muhammad, and the Sirah is more of a chronological narrative, but they coincide. But most of what we know, really, if it was just based on the Quran, it's a very incoherent, mostly poetic work in Arabic, which would be very confusing, which is really why Muslims need the Hadith and need the Sirah, because if it was just the Quran, it's very hard to make sense of it, and you can interpret it in various ways. This is why Sunnis turn to the Sunnah, which is the Hadith and the example, and the Sirah. So yeah, most of what we're talking about really traces to those sources.
Tell me about Muhammad. What kind of man he was? What does history tell us about this man?
So it's interesting because I just did an actually deep dive in this, and what I find fascinating is we have very early records of Muhammad from non-Muslim sources. The earliest is 2 years after his death, and just to put this in perspective, the earliest non-Christian reference to Jesus is 60 years after his death or crucifixion. Okay, so 2 years, that's really good. And what it is basically a record of people saying that a man arose in Arabia saying he's a prophet, but people don't believe him because prophets who all they have, their claim to fame is just bloodshed and war, are not real prophets. Okay, and the same account talks about how he promises heaven to his followers. So if you really look at the very early non-Muslim sources, especially, they all make it unequivocally clear there's a man whose name or his title is Muhammad, the praised one, and he claims he's from God, but his modus operandi, the way he behaves, is all about violence, warfare, plunder, sexuality, concubinage, etc. And if you die, you go to heaven. And even in his time, there's a lot of people who doubt him. Okay, so that's, to me, the bare bone minimum understanding of Muhammad based on very reliable contemporary records.
How many wives did he have?
Well, so according to, he had, I think I want to say 9 or 10, which is more than what any Muslim man should have. A Muslim man should have 4. But of course, he always, new revelations would come to him, which would justify more license to him sexually. His own wife, Aisha, his young wife, his child bride, who I believe married when she was 9, though he had possession of her when she was 6. There's in the hadith where she says, I find it amazing how your Lord, Allah, always reveals things that you need right when you need them, because he was given a license to have more wives than every other Muslim man. So, even in the sources, it comes out that there's a lot of cynicism towards what he's doing.
What do Muslims say when they hear that their main prophet Muhammad had a 6 to 9 year old wife?
That just
How do they justify it?
It's not that they justify it. They see it as they've just now been given license to do the same.
In Iraq.
Everywhere, actually. I mean, yes, in Iraq, it's now becoming actually part of the law. But historically, because Muhammad did that, that's why you had basically what we would call pedophilia, but then it would be normal. Oh, I'm a Muslim man, I'm 30, I'm 40, and I'm going to marry a 9-year-old.
And Muhammad was 50 plus when he married Aisha.
Yeah.
And she was
9.
We met her 6 and married when she was 9. Why do you think Islam succeeded in the first place? Because he kind of, that was kind of Christianity, but a little bit tweaked. You can have more wives, right? 4 wives. That's amazing for a male, right? So why did Islam succeed in the first place?
Well, there it is. It's not just you can have. It's a very male-centric religion. It's trying to gratify the male because it's not even 4 wives. You can have 4 wives and as many sex slaves as you want, concubines.
That's according to the Quran?
That is in the Quran.
That's holy.
Yes, it's holy. They're called, in Arabic, ma malakat aymankum, which means... So the verses that say you can have 4 wives, they usually say, I want to say 4:3, chapter 4:3 is one of them, but there's others. But it says, you can have as many as 4 wives, and ma malakat aymankum, that which your right hand possesses, which according to Islamic exegetes means that, female infidels that have been conquered in war, sex slaves, limitless number. As far as why it became so popular, I think that's one of the reasons, because it really gratified the most basic and primordial urges of men. It's said now, and this is actually why it became very popular amongst tribal peoples, Arabs, and then later Turks, pastoral tribal peoples, and later Mongols, Berbers as well. It never really settled or, became it didn't resonate with sedentary civilized people. It was always nomadic people. And the reason is because those people were already tribal. To be tribal meant it's us against everyone else. Everyone else is the enemy, and it's our duty to attack them, kill them, enslave them, plunder them. Okay, that is good. So Muhammad's genius, if you will, is that he took the same tribal mores of his society, 7th century Arabia, but re-articulated them in a theological paradigm. So now it wasn't just, from I attack, it's us against them. Now it became, yes, it's us against them. But us was no longer the blood tribe. It was the Muslims, the Muslims. And them was the non-Muslims, even if they are blood relatives. So even the Quran says, if you have to hate and war upon and distance yourself from your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, if they're not your sons, your whatever, if they're not Muslims, they're the enemy.
Quran says so.
Yes. If we have time, I can pull out the verse for you. I think it's 64 is the main one. And it says, I'm paraphrasing, but it says you have a good example in Abraham of the Old Testament, Ibrahim to them. So the Genesis account of Abraham, God calls him out, and he leaves the pagan world that he's in, and he goes and finds the new nation of Israel. In the Muslim account, he does the same thing, but he also tells his formal family and tribe that we hate you. Enmity shall last forever between us until you believe in Allah alone. So that has sort of become articulated and codified in Islamic worldview. It's actually part of a doctrine called al-wala wal-bara, which I usually translate as loyalty and enmity, or love and hate. And it basically means you have to love and be close to Muslims. It has nothing to do with blood. And you have to hate non-Muslims, even if they're your relatives. Okay?
So Allah in the Quran has 99 names, correct?
Yeah, I don't know if it's in the Quran. Yeah, I think it is in the Quran, but yeah.
Can you name me at least 10? Because I was doing a podcast with the Imam. He couldn't tell me at least 3 of them.
The ones
99 names.
Yeah. The compassionate, the merciful. I've seen them all, but the ones that stick in my mind are usually the ones that are unflattering. He's also the makkar, which means he's the deceiver. Okay,
he's the master of.
He's he's everything. I can't name them like the Imam. I've seen them, I've encountered them, but there are all sorts of names. The only ones I remember are the ones that you would think are controversial, and the main one that's always pointed out is the makkar, which means the deceiver, the trickster. He's like a Loki figure almost amongst Muslims.
But in the Bible, the father of lies is who?
Satan. Yeah.
Why in the Quran Jesus included, and why do they praise him? The Muslims kind of love Jesus, right?
Well, yes and no. What it is so Islam is the new religion, right? Muhammad comes and Judaism exists, Christianity exists. The two are tied together, right? Jesus is a Jew. The New Testament talks about the Old Testament. There's a continuity in there. And then you have this Arab guy in Arabia. So what Muhammad did is he appropriated, to give legitimacy to his movement, he had to connect himself to Judaism and Christianity, because that's what everyone knew. Those are the traditional names that have the weight of antiquity: Abraham, Moses, Jesus. So who's this guy?
Household name.
Yeah, so he has to bring them in. So what he did is he used them and he said, yeah, of course, they're all true and we love them. But he recast them and made them such so that they were basically promoting him. So basically, Jesus came to earth primarily to tell us about the Paraclete, and the Paraclete's the Holy Spirit, but it's a Greek word which means the comforter. According to Muslims, the comforter is Muhammad. So Jesus came to proclaim Muhammad. And everything was turned around. So yes, Abraham is good and he's a prophet, and everyone's a prophet. Jesus is a prophet. So Muslims believe, a lot of the people who want you to, think that there's a, dialogue or there's some sort of commonality between Muslims and Christians say what you just said. They love Jesus. They believe he was born of a virgin, that he was sinless, that he was perfect, that he performed miracles. That all sounds great. But they reject the cardinal teachings of Christ. They reject he's the Son of God. They reject he was crucified. They reject he was resurrected. He didn't die for mankind's sin. So the really important things that they reject. But again, it's always taking them to give themselves some sort of legitimacy and saying, yes, we're part of that old ancient heritage of Judaism, Christianity, but then they are rewritten in a different way, which is very different, incidentally, from what Christians do. So obviously Christians and Jews are different because Christians believe in Christ and Jews don't. But what's interesting is Christians took what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, as they are. So if you look at the Bible, right, and you have the Old Testament, that is the same books that the Jews have.
Tanakh.
Yeah, from Genesis all the way to, I think, Malachi. Okay, sure. They have the same books, and the Christians did not change them. Now, Christians have their own interpretation. So Abraham now is no longer the father of Israel, is now Christians. So there's interpretational changes, but the text is the same. What Muhammad did and what Muslims do is completely different. They said the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way it's written, is wrong. And Muhammad is here to give us the new version. So he claims them, but he changes who they are and what they said. So Jesus, like I said, he's actually a prophet, and he's here to proclaim the same thing that Muhammad is. And when he comes back on Resurrection Day, and he will, he's going to break all the crosses and kill all the pigs because he's like Muhammad. And that's all. So you see, it's all rewritten in a way to validate Islam. All right. So
in Islam, Jesus, when he comes back for the second time, he's going to judge.
Yeah.
So if they say that Jesus is not the Son of God and he is not the God himself, then how can he judge on the judgment day? If only God can judge.
I may not be correct about if he's going to judge, but he's known to be part of the judgment day. He's part of the Islamic eschatology, end days. But his exact role, like I said, and primarily it's to tell Christians how they are wrong. So he's going to break the cross, he's going to kill the pigs, and he's going to cancel jizya. Jizya was the way Christians can remain Christians, is they pay tribute. So now by canceling jizya, it means you can't even be a Christian. You have to become a true Muslim, because Jesus is a Muslim in the Islamic rendering, Isa. But as far as the judgment issue, I'm not really sure.
What's the problem with the pigs?
I don't know. Muhammad didn't dig on swine. So, I mean, maybe it goes back to Judaism. Islam appropriated a lot of Jewish things, and I know the pig isn't popular. It's not kosher amongst the Jews, so it may be he was copying that as well. But yeah.
What about dogs? Muslims cannot have dogs, right?
Yeah, they're not supposed to. Muhammad says if a household has a dog, angels will not visit it. And so until this very day, dogs are really mistreated from a humane point of view. And I actually wrote an article about it very recently. And it goes back to a hadith where Muhammad hated dogs. And in some countries, they'll just kill them outright because
dogs
of that.
Only, Cats?
He actually liked cats. So amongst Muslims, cats are approvable. You can have a cat because Muhammad liked cats.
And cats were worshipped basically in Egypt, correct?
Well, yeah, that's pre-Islamic, so I don't know if there's any connection, but yeah, he liked cats apparently.
So what happens prior to 1096, prior to the First Crusade? And because once I was in school, let's say 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, I was told, although Lithuania is a very Christian country, Catholic country, but I was told that the Crusades were horrible. Incidents, innocent people were killed, slaughtered, raped, and etc.
Right. The country you come from, and Estonia and those sort of Baltic regions don't like the Crusades because they were Christianized in parts of those Crusades, including at the hands of the Teutonic Knights, a military order, a Catholic military order. So the original Crusades had nothing to do with that. It was against Islam. And the very first crusade, which was called in 1095, was completely against Muslims because they were persecuting and horrifically killing Christians and destroying churches. And going back now to Constantine and the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was a pilgrimage site since before Constantine, but especially after Constantine. And it continued being a pilgrimage site even after the Muslim conquest of the Holy Land around 637. But Christians would suffer and they had to pay taxes, and sometimes they would be attacked and killed by Muslims, but they still would go as a sacrifice because holy sites were very important back in those days. So that goes on. I'm just going a little before the First Crusade. And then by the time of, around 900 or 1000, the Turks start rising and they become a very dominant force in the Islamic world. And they're Muslims. They were originally imported as slave soldiers by the caliphates, especially the Abbasid Caliphate at that time. And they would bring these Turkic warriors and convert them to Islam, and they became the greatest warriors. And then before you know it, they actually became the standard bearers of jihad, and the Arabs' time wanes. And really the caliphate is a puppet figure, the Abbasid Caliphate, which the Turks keep, but they're in charge, they're in power. And under them, the first dynasty really is, well, not the first, but the more dominant one is the Seljuk Turks. And they start attacking Asia Minor and around the middle of the 11th century, 1050. And very horrific. The bloodshed is just mind-boggling as it's recorded in the sources, especially of Armenians, because Armenians are a large nation at this time in Asia Minor, but also as they go later, further in against Greeks and so forth. And the records, Matthew of Edessa is a chronicler who's a near contemporary. He talks about tens of thousands of Christians being massacred, even more enslaved.
Just because they refused to convert?
Yeah, by the Turks. And churches ritually desecrated and destroyed. In one city, Ani, which was the capital at the time of Armenia, it was known as the city of 1,001 churches. They were all burned and destroyed. And a large crucifix was sent to Baghdad as a trophy of war, again underscoring the ideological aspect to this. And also the pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land to see the Holy Sepulchre were being attacked in very vile ways. One of the more famous and horrific instances was a large German pilgrimage, which was in 1064 or 1065. And they talk about how they attacked and killed everyone, and they took a nun and gang raped her until she died in front of everyone. And the eyewitness says, and the Turks did this often to pilgrims. And that's what gave rise to the First Crusade in 1095.
Just to spread the horror?
Just the sheer horror and attacks on Christians. And so Pope Urban II in 1095, in part responding to the Roman Emperor Alexius, who was now because all these were formerly Eastern Roman Byzantine territories. So he asked for aid from the West, and he described what was happening. And that's exactly what Pope Urban and all the other preachers of the First Crusade were talking about, which is what was happening to Christians, what was happening to the Holy Land, what was happening to pilgrims. And that was the rise of the First Crusade. It was a noble venture. It was altruistic. It was about actually righting wrongs. They actually would quote the verse that, no greater love does a man have than to lay down his life for his fellow man. And that's what they were doing. And also in the context of, loving God and loving your fellow man. So loving your fellow man was going on a crusade to help Eastern Christians. Loving God was going to go and liberate the Holy Land. Because they were mocking. So in 1009, which is even way before 1095, one caliph, the Holy Sepulchre, the large, massive complex that Constantine built, he destroyed it. He completely destroyed it, plundered it, and he destroyed 30,000 other churches. according to Muslim sources. Most Western historians don't say this. They say
30,000.
30,000, and most Western historians will put the number 300 or 3,000, and they'll say, oh, that's a scribal error. The Muslims are wrong. But it's a Muslim. It's al-Makrizi. It's an Egyptian historian.
So they were not just boasting. They
No.
were telling the truth.
Yeah. And it's a reflection of how Christian that region was. Because before the Islamic conquest, even in 1009, that's only 400 years later, it was still a very, very heavily Christian region, Egypt and Greater Syria. So 30,000 churches and the Holy Sepulchre destroyed. So all of that, and the Christians of Europe remembered that. So that's what gave rise and led to the First Crusade.
What was the draft like in the First Crusade?
The draft?
Yeah, who was those people?
There was no draft. It was unbridled enthusiasm, and it was women and children, peasants. You couldn't stop them. They were so, and it's actually considered one of today's great mysteries, because there were calls to other crusades before that, including when that caliph destroyed the sepulchre and the 30,000 churches. That too provoked a lot of Christians in the West, but nothing came of it. But for some reason, when Pope Urban called for this one, it's known in history as one of the most massive campaigns, where it was hundreds of thousands of just peasants took off to the Holy Land.
What they were promised?
Okay, so they were promised remission of sins. So if you go and you die, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were promised remission of sins. It was a pilgrimage. The Crusades were actually pilgrimages. So Christians wanted to do and should do pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And the crusade was seen as an armed pilgrimage. So you're doing two things. You're going to go and you're going to fight the pagans and help Christians and liberate the Holy Land. And you're going to do the pilgrimage, which you should do. Okay, so yeah, there were incentives, of course, which was the remission of sins was the main big one. But they were also, if you look at the sources, the people were really driven just by the actual events themselves. So we can say, yeah, there was a theological component that motivated them. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it was really trying to redress all these wrongs that I just described, because that comes out in the sources. That's what really they preached, Urban, Peter the Hermit, and all these other preachers. And that's what really drove the people to go on the crusade.
Any documented atrocities from those people from the Crusades?
Yeah, the main ones, especially, you have different movements, because it wasn't a coherent force, like I was saying. It was just people on their own started going. And among some of them is, they're known as the peasant crusaders. And so they were leaderless peasants. And, the main attacks was on Jews that happened in Europe. Right, I think I want to say maybe 1096 or right around 1097, around Germany. And their logic, the peasants would rile each other up because they'd be traveling by land on foot, and they'd get tired. And they say, why are we going all the way to fight the Muslim haters of Christ when we have them right here in our own land, the Jews? Mm-hmm. And so they would attack them and plunder them. But it's notable to point out that the actual authorities, the church, and even the higher nobles would come against it. They would condemn it, and they would actually try to defend the Jews. And they would sometimes even excommunicate the Christians who did this.
The Great Schism occurred in what year?
I think the formal year, it's in the year 1000 something. I don't know, 1012 or 1094.
So it's after the Crusade?
No, it's before.
Before?
It's before.
So there was Orthodox already and Catholics?
Yeah, the Catholics and the Orthodox, as we call them today, always existed. But, today Orthodox is big O and Catholic is big C. But historically, they were both small o and both small c. Catholic just meant universal. Orthodox meant the straight way. Till today, Catholics tell you we're the Orthodox ones because we're the straight way. Mm-hmm. And the Orthodox tell you, no, we're the universal church. So, these terms, they have their traditional meaning and they have now their big meaning.
So in total, there were how many crusades? 8?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, but traditional number is 9.
So let's say they didn't succeed. What kind of world would we live in right now?
Well, really, the only one that did succeed is the first one that we're talking about. And it was essentially, the actual conquests or reconquests that they made were all nullified by 1291. So by 1099, the Crusaders, a few years after the first crusade is called in 1095, they've achieved their goal. They've liberated the Holy Land. Jerusalem is under Christian, Latin, Frankish control, as well as other cities.
And they stayed there?
Yeah, they stayed there. They liberated Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, various other areas. And they stayed there and they continued fighting the Muslims until 1291. So almost 200 years. And by 1291, that's when basically they're completely eliminated and kicked out of the Holy Land.
So let's say they didn't succeed in the first crusade. What kind of world would we live in right now?
I would say not much different because the actual benefits that they accrued were all nullified. And so we're sort of back to where we started. They conquered it and they lost it. So they never had it. In other words, we are today where we were before they conquered it. It was still Muslim territory.
So Muslims would not conquer Europe. I wouldn't speak Arabic right now.
Muslims wouldn't speak Arabic?
No, they wouldn't conquer Europe if not the Crusades. Or would they?
So before the Crusades, the Muslims conquered all of North Africa and the Middle East and Spain, and they went into Europe and stopped at Tours in 732, and they continued attacking Europe. And then you have the Crusades, which is kind of different because now it's the Europeans are striking back and going to the Muslim lands and the Holy Land. And, that's what preoccupies Muslims and Christians for 2 centuries. Then they lose. Then the Muslims continue what they had started, which was attacking the Christian world. So they had conquered Spain, and that's still going on. You have the Reconquista. But now you have the rise of the Ottoman Turks. So after the Seljuk Turks, who were the primary antagonists of the Crusades, you have another group of Turks who are known as the Ottomans. And now they become the new attackers of Europe, which is after the Crusades. So 1291's end of the Crusades. Right around 1300 is the rise of the Ottomans. And it's late 1300s. Now they're entering into Europe and conquering the Balkans. And then by 1453, very famously, Constantinople is conquered.
Why did Europe stay Christian? Who stopped the Islam?
Who stopped the Muslims?
Yes.
The Christians of Europe. They fought back.
For centuries.
Yeah.
Back and forth.
Back and forth. So from the Crusades are over 1291, 1300s, and all throughout the 1300s, the Turks start invading Europe. Okay, and the Christians of Europe, all of whom are at this point Catholic or Orthodox, because no Protestant Reformation yet, fight back. And you have some of the most, wild war battles during this time. Of course, a lot of them are actually defenders of the West, where I talk about John Hunyadi and Skanderbeg of Albania and Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. This is all in the 15th century, right before the Protestant Reformation. And they all fight back, to the Christians of the time, they saw it as a civilizational conflict that they had to do this. Otherwise, they know what Islam has been doing. It's been swallowing up so much of Christendom for centuries. They knew and understood that North Africa, Egypt, all the way to Morocco and Syria and Asia Minor, only recently, all Christian regions. Asia Minor is where most of St. Paul's epistles were into. That's how Christian it was. They knew that was all conquered and swallowed up by Islam, and they are next. So it was a very existential life and death struggle.
So at that time, Europe is fighting Islam and the Muslims, and at the same time they're fighting each other, right? So a 100-year-old war between France and England, etc. At the same time, what's happening in the Middle East? Are Muslims fighting each other as well?
Yeah, they are. It's the same sort of thing. During this time, the 2 primary powers of the Muslim world are the Ottomans in Turkey and the Mamluks. The Mamluks, and it's just an Arabic word, means he who is owned, a slave. Mamluks were, again, more Turkish or Circassian tribesmen who were imported, Islamized, became slave soldiers. But then they got too powerful, and they actually overthrew the Muslims who had imported them, and they became the new rulers. And their headquarters was in Egypt. So the Turks, the Ottomans, were in Turkey, as we know it, and the Mamluks were primarily in Egypt and also in Syria as well. And they fought until 1517, when the Ottomans actually conquered them and absorbed their lands as well.
And those wars had nothing to do with the Shias and Sunnis.
No, the Mamluks and the Ottomans were both Sunnis, but you did have the Shias in Iran also during this time. And in fact, I believe the Ottomans, as part of their pretext in their war in the Mamluks, was because the Mamluks were supposedly helping the Shias of Iran against the Ottomans. So yeah, the Shia thing was always there. But these particular wars that I just mentioned, the main 2 powers were both Sunnis.
So what's interesting? So Christianity has Orthodox, Protestants, and Catholics, right? And Muslims, Islam has Shias and Sunnis. Mm-hmm. We don't fight each other. They do till this day. Mm-hmm. Why?
Why don't Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox fight? And why do Sunnis and Shias fight?
Yeah.
Well, I would argue Yeah, obviously in the West they don't fight anymore, and some people will tell you that's because all of them have lost their their zeal, and that's why. In other words, it's because of a more secularist atmosphere that all Christians, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, are able to coexist, which is fine.
Which is great.
Yeah. In other words, I'm trying to say it's not necessarily because they've lost their zeal. It's just because they've lived, they can tolerate each other. So that's good. The Sunnis and Shias actually, by and large, what happens with the Sunnis and Shias is when they have conflicts with the greater infidel world, Christians, let's say, they actually either ally or they at least leave each other alone. It's only when they don't have that kind of problem that they start fighting with each other. Right,
but they're fighting each other just simply because of the heritage.
Yeah, the origin of the Sunni Shia rift, ironically, is it has to do with who is going to be the successor of Muhammad. So the Shias believe that a caliph means successor. So the caliph must be a descendant of Muhammad, specifically through his only surviving daughter, Fatima, and his first cousin, Ali, and they have Hassan and Hussein. So their descendants must be the leaders of the Islamic world. That's the Shia view. That's the minority view. The Sunni view is essentially, it obviously doesn't have to be a descendant of... So anyway, it starts off that way, and that they start warring after the Battle of Karbala in 680. But now they're very much different, even theologically. So because of all these centuries, almost 14 centuries. So even now, theologically, the Shias are very much more mystical. Their religion has branched off as opposed to Sunnism. It's funny because a lot of people, we think of Iran as the great enemy, but it's a Shia nation. Really, the radical, problematic Muslims are all Sunnis. So if you look at even the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Hamas. These are all Sunni organizations, and it makes sense because Sunnis are the majority. Okay? They're 90% of the Islamic world, but also their theology. So Saudi Arabia is our friend, but its theology is much more violent than Shia Islam, who's our enemy. So obviously there's a political dimension here as well that transcends the actual religious aspect.
So caliph is a successor?
Successor, yeah.
What's a caliphate?
The Arabic word is a khalif and or khalifa and caliphate. A caliphate is basically a system of governance based on a caliph. So it's the rule of a caliph, a caliphate.
What's a jihad? Because when I was doing a podcast with the imam, he said that jihad is like the way of some kind of to protest. It's jihad to do something, right?
Yeah.
But what we know jihad is, they say always, the holy war. The holy war against the non-believers.
Holy war is an old English translation of jihad, which is perfectly suitable because it is that is what jihad is. The game that some Muslim apologists play is they say that the word jihad means to struggle. And that we as Muslims are supposed to struggle to bring Islam to whatever, in a good way. That's what they say. We're struggling to help empower Islam. Okay, well, historically, that was done through violence. So jihad meant holy war. So if a Muslim said, I'm doing jihad, he meant I'm attacking the kafir, the infidel, through violence. So that's what it meant historically for centuries. But what's funny is, the apologetic game where they tell you jihad means struggle, it actually underscores how the issue of jihad is even worse than we thought. Because it's true, it means to struggle. It does not mean physical struggle only. That has been its primary manifestation. But it does mean that Muslims must struggle in all ways to help empower and make Islam supreme. And so until today, you have Islamic scholars who talk about the jihad. They have different names. I'll just give you the English translation. But jihad of the pen, jihad of the tongue, jihad of the money, jihad of the womb. And all of them are to serve Islam, to empower it over infidels. So jihad of the pen means propaganda. So does jihad of the tongue, which means lying. Say whatever you have to say to help Islam look good or to demoralize non-Muslims, okay? The money jihad means you fund the jihad. I'm a rich Saudi. Okay, I don't have to commit. I'm not going to fight, but I'm going to send them millions. Okay. Jihad of the womb means I'm going to help the cause by having as many children as possible, all of them Muslims. All right. And they actually say this all the time. This is happening in Europe. This is one of the jihads. So yes, jihad as an Arabic word simply means to struggle on behalf of Islam, but that doesn't make it better. It actually makes it worse. Its primary manifestation historically was through force, but as I just described, it has other ways that it's being done too as well now.
So Islam is a religion. What's an Islamism?
That's a good question. Islamism is a way for a lot of modern Western commentators to try to distance Islam from the bad things about Islam. So it's a way of trying to say Islam as a religion is okay. It's the bad stuff that people do, the terrorism, the jihad and all that. That's Islamism. It's sort of an academic distinction. I think it has a political correct aspect to it. Rather than say Islam and offend or all the Muslims of the world, you pretend that it's a specific ideology. Okay, but at the same time, it has some merit because the stuff that modern day Muslims who are radicals or whatever promote sometimes is slightly different from traditional Islam. They're both still violent and intolerant towards non-Muslims, but it almost has a Western influence to it. So I think it's okay to use the word Islamism because it's its own unique sort of thing, which is anachronistic if you want to compare it to historic Islam. Okay, but long story short, either way, whether it's Islam or Islamism, they all trace back to the teachings of Islam primarily.
Why do you think the countries of the Muslim countries differ so much from each other? Let's say Saudi Arabia, UAE are much more different than I would say, especially now Syria or Iran, Pakistan. Why do you think there is such a difference between them?
Well, you can't discount the cultural and national differences. So before Islam, Pakistan, they're Hindus, and Arabia, they're Arabs. And you have Indonesians, you have Turks. So they all have their own culture. A lot of them have their own languages. And, that comes out. So even though they're all Muslims, still at the same time, they have their own national characteristics. And it becomes sort of a blend. Their Islam blends in with their particular culture and their language. So it's still part of that human element, that still is alive regardless of the religious dynamic.
So we're saying right now, so we're being told, especially by the news outlets and etc., that Iran is our enemy, right? Iran is the enemy of the West. But Iran, they are not Arabs, they're Persians, and they were not Muslims. They were conquered. Mm-hmm. So I was having this Uber drive, I want to say, let's say 2 months ago. And the guy was from Iran and he migrated here, I want to say 5 to 7 years ago. And he told me that people in Iran, they don't like Islam at all. They don't like this radical religion of theirs because it was imposed to them. And he was saying that it's just a matter of time when they do a revolution and that Iran is not going to be a Muslim country. What are your thoughts on that?
I largely agree. A lot of the Persian people themselves, when we think of Iran, we think of the mullahs and we think of this as Islamic Republic and they're all, radical Muslims. It's called the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mm-hmm. It is a theocracy, essentially. But ironically, the people are not. The people are very much fed up with it, and they're actually very westernized. Historically, if you looked at the Muslim nations, Persia was by far one of the most westernized nations, much more than Egypt and, of course, Saudi Arabia and all these countries, Syria, Lebanon. Persia was the one because, like you said, they maintained their culture, their language. Egypt had its own language. Syria had its own language. All these the countries that we call Arab world, it's because they all speak Arabic now. But they actually had their own language, and it's now been suppressed. To their credit, places like Persia kept it, managed to maintain their cultural identity. And I think it still lives on still. So, yeah, the people of Iran, despite the image we have, are actually largely very secular and Western-oriented. It's just the regime that holds them together and which many of them hate.
But that regime is pretty new, right? Since 1979.
Yeah.
Prior to that was Shah. Prior to Shah, what was Iran like?
It was still, Shah, we're talking in the 70s. So even before that, usually Ataturk, who's the Turk, and he was the first one to really start reforming. And this is way back in, I think, the 30s or maybe 20s. So it was like the Shah. In fact, it was, I believe, his father. And he was also very secular and westward looking. Basically, and remember, Persia, even the Ottoman Empire is what the West dealt with during the colonial era, but Persia wasn't. It was its own, Shia manifestation, and it was again very secularized and became It was one of the most secular Western-looking nations, and for a long time, even before the Shah. And the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic was sort of a backlash, and it was a sort of, it was because it was getting too Western, it was overly Western. So this was a sort of conservative reactionary movement. But I think since then, a lot of the Persians actually regret it.
So I see from time to time, I see sayings like Christians are the true colonizers, right? They colonize the entire world, especially North America, South America, etc. But at the same time, Muslims are not. Is it true?
Absolutely not. The only reason people get away with this argument is they present it in a vacuum. In other words, and I see this all the time. I'll give you an example. I wrote the book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. So what do? Thanks. I talk about every century and what was happening between the West and Islam. Today, what people do, so I'll give you a perfect example. There's a book that came out the same year that book came out, and I know this because my literary agent told me, and he thought it would be a competitor book. It was by some professor at Georgetown, and it was called Jihad and Crusade, the 1,000-Year Struggle Between something like the North and the South. If you look at that book, it's maybe 700 pages. It's humongous. And it's about the 1,000-Year War. But guess what? From the very beginning of the conflict, the time of Muhammad, until 1800, it gets 30 pages. Okay?
Interesting.
Yeah. And then the last 200 gets the whole book. So what's the difference? What happened? The last 200 years is when actually... so the beginning, the years that get 30 pages, which in my book are the main pages, is when Islam is attacking and conquering and colonizing Christian territory. Okay? So that's completely ignored. And then, if you look at the true history, as I describe it, around 1800, finally Europe, which was always at the receiving end and being attacked and was the weak one against the Muslim empires, especially the Ottoman Empire, finally it's reversed. Now they're strong and the Muslims are weak, and now the Christians start invading North Africa and the Middle East, etc., and they start colonizing it. So what people do now is they ignore the whole, 90% of the history when it was the opposite, and they pretend everything was fine until Europe started doing this. They're the bad guys, okay? And even that, colonization itself was a reflection and a reaction to the perennial 1,000-year jihad. If you look at what the French and the British, how they thought, they were going into these lands because they knew these were the violent, hostile Muslim lands that had conquered and attacked Christians and Western civilization, and they wanted to put an end to it. So it was itself was a reaction to what Muslims had been doing for centuries against the West. But today, the narrative that you're mentioning, Christians are the bad guys, not Muslims, is because they completely omit and ignore the bulk of history. So the book I'm telling you ignores, the first 1,000 years, and then the last 200 years, it just sits and dwells at, the horrible Europeans, look, they conquered this region, and Muslims are still aggrieved about it. And it makes sense if you don't know the actual history.
Okay, I got it. Sharia law, is it mentioned in the Quran, and what is it? What's the Sharia law?
Yeah, I don't know if it's mentioned in the Quran. Sharia is a word which, like a lot of Islamic words, it means the pathway to the water well. Okay, because people in Arabia are living in a desert, and Sharia or Shara means the roadway to life, water. So in Islamic usage and terminology, it becomes the road to life, okay, which is basically, or we can translate it as Islamic law, which is what Muslims must do to be good Muslims. It's the pathway to life. That's what Sharia means. And it's essentially, it's laws. So Islamic law is a very legitimate and fair translation. And it's laws that are based on the Quran. The twin pillars are usually seen as the Quran, and the Sunnah, which is the Hadith and the Sirah, and whatever Muslims think are reliable, authentic teachings by Muhammad as derived from the Sunnah. And based on that and some other things like Ijma means, whatever the consensus is. If there's some controversial issue, what do the ulama or the scholars believe? That's also, and they use something called qiyas, which means analogy. So for example, Islamic law doesn't talk about smoking, but it does say don't drink, and because that means don't harm yourself. So smoking is also not necessarily haram; it's makruh, which means disliked. Anyway, it's pretty convoluted, but that's all what it is. It's Islamic law.
But they're having right now Sharia trials in Europe. Is that correct?
Sharia trials?
Yeah.
I don't know. Oh, yeah. Yes, in places in Europe, because they have such a large Muslim population, they're giving in and allowing Islamic law to trump native law of Europe, wherever Muslims are, in the name of multiculturalism and diversity and etc. So yeah, but from what I understand, in various Muslim-heavy regions, in I think England especially, they actually have what amounts to Sharia law for Muslims to actually it's for Muslims to judge themselves against each other. So they allow them to do it through their own courts.
So we're in the year 2025. Where do you think we are at right now, especially Europe? In regards to Islam trying to conquer Europe, conquer the Western society?
Well, I've looked at various Pew polls, and they talk about the demography. What interests me is the demography of the changing face of Europe. I always say this, I find it very ironic, but most Western people, they think they're unfortunately, they're very centric. They just think of their own civilization. So they look at the West, they look at America, they look at Europe, and they still see the majority are still white people, including in Europe. They don't realize, though, that white people are like about 4% of the world population. So they're a very tiny, tiny minority. 4%. Yeah. Look it up. It's something like that. Of the world. I mean, just think about it.
From 8
just the
billion.
Indians alone, I think, are 2 billion, and
Correct.
the Chinese are like 2 billion,
Indonesia,
and the Africans, and so it's a very small minority. And I marvel that it is this tiny minority that feels incumbent upon itself to bring everyone into its land and to suppress its own culture and its own heritage and its own religion in the name of diversity. And it's just amazing to me. It's a sort of suicide. No other country, no other civilization does this, and rightfully so. Why should they? Okay, but I don't know why Europeans feel the need to just flood their lands with, especially when they are such a tiny minority to start with.
You have no explanation to this.
No, I do have an explanation. The explanation is, it's very convoluted, but the easy explanation is the leaders of Europe are intentionally doing this, whether it's because they're just ideologically compromised or stupid, or whether there's an agenda which is against their own people, which may very well be the case. In England, it's reached the point where you can't even say the truth about what's happening without going to jail.
Literally.
And this is amazing. And this is supposed to be a country. So obviously the rulers of England, whether they are British natives, hate and are warring on their own people. It's just as clear as that. There's no other explanation. But people can't wrap their minds around that. Or in other areas, they keep bringing and importing more and more Muslim migrants, and all you see is more and more violence and criminality. And if you talk about it, you get arrested. So if the people of Europe see this, and maybe they do or they don't, but they're not doing anything about it, they've been very much emasculated and paralyzed, handicapped. And so what's happening today, if this was happening to the ancestors, the defenders of the West that I write about, they would have gone to war a long time ago.
A new crusade.
Of course, against their own people, the leaders. But today's Europeans are not going to do that.
But Europe is being conquered right now by soft power, not the hard power.
Exactly.
That's genius.
Of course.
You don't even have to go to war.
Yeah.
They let them in.
Yeah, exactly. The history of Europe has been fighting tooth and nail against Islam to keep it out and killing and sacrificing themselves. And now, after finally winning, they go out of their way to bring them in. And the Muslims that are being brought in, a lot of them are still behaving in the old way, violently, criminality. So it's amazing, it's suicidal. What other way can I explain it,
So let's take West and East. West, let's say Europe, and maybe then Northern America in the age of century, 19th to 20th century. Why do almost all the inventions come from the Western civilization, not from the Eastern? We got mathematics came from Arabs, right? Something came from China, but it's like you can count it on fingers on your both hands. Why there are, I want to say 90% of all the inventions from the West, not from the East. Does it correlate with the religion?
Yeah, well, so the Western narrative would be because once religion in Europe was sort of sidelined and secularism was allowed to breathe, science could develop and people were no longer afraid of being called heretics or blasphemers because they give you the stories about Copernicus and, the earth and the shape of it and the sun, what goes around what. And if you said the wrong thing, you could get in trouble with church authorities. So that's the traditional narrative of why in the West science and technology has progressed, because the shackles of religion were no longer there to oppress people and they could think freely. That's the traditional narrative. Whereas in the Islamic world, for example, you definitely don't have that. There's this famous saying, which is the doors of ijtihad, which means the doors of free interpretation were closed like in the year 1100, and everything in Islamic world became very wooden and literal, and if you actually try to break through that mold, you're a heretic. So just accept the world as it is, don't think about it. That sort of thing. So that's the general narrative of why it succeeded. But I would argue that Christianity itself fosters and allow that. So the other argument is it actually succeeded in the West because the West was Christian. And Christianity actually lays the seed and allows science to vent. There's nothing in Christ's teaching that says you can't, think and engage in scientific methodology, for example. So I think that is also why it rose. And if you look at it's not even just science and technology. If you just look at progress, governance, freedom, ethics, morality, it came from Christian nations. And why? It wasn't from It wasn't from China. It wasn't from the Islamic world. The stuff that the whole world wants, and this is why they moved to the West: progress and technology and enlightenment and freedom. It all was from Christian lands. It didn't grow in other lands, Muslim or Confucian or Hindu. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, but it's like every aspect of the world, right? Music, Western civilization, movies, art, like almost everything. Yeah. Of course, you've got great art in the Middle East, but almost no music, no...
music is bad. According to... Even art is bad. You can't have representations. It's haram, so is music.
You can't represent Muhammad and the Allah.
Well, yes, but you're not also representing anything. Drawing a human is considered idolatry. It's like I'm worshiping the human. So that's why if you really look at Islamic art, it's limited to patterns. So
this would be an idolatry.
This right here.
Yes.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. This is total idolatry to Muslims.
And the frescoes in Italy as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah. This is why when they conquered Constantinople, for example, or Hagia Sophia, they covered and painted over all. Some of them have been actually able to be refurbished and brought back, but the frescoes and the icons, and a lot of them were destroyed ritually.
Hypothetically, if you take away all the oil from Middle East, would it be as successful as it is right now?
Of course not. If you took away all the oil from the Middle East, Islam would not be a problem. Islam is a problem primarily because of oil wealth, because all of what we call radicalization and the dissemination of radical jihadist literature and the support of radical mosques and satellite stations is all entirely funded by oil wealth from Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf nations, entirely. And if they didn't have that wealth, what we call Islam would be such a weak thing right now, but it's being buttressed and supported and spearheaded entirely by the many, many billions of dollars that come just from oil.
But it's just a matter of time when it ends.
Yeah, depending on who you ask, it could be 50 years or 100 years, and who knows what will happen in the meantime. But yeah, it should end, but it could have ended a long time ago. The people who found the oil in Arabia were Western people, and at the time the Arabs were living like Muhammad in tents and Bedouins, and in the time of Saudi Arabia. They didn't even find it. I think there's a good cause and a good argument that Europeans and Westerners or the whole world can appropriate and take the oil and let the Arabs go back to the way they were living, which is according to true Sharia. In fact, the wealth has corrupted the Arabs because they're not living according to the Sunnah of Muhammad, who lived in the desert. They're multimillionaires who live in lavish, So do them a favor, take away that money, and so it doesn't support all this jihadist ideology that's being disseminated around the world.
Yeah, but with all that money, they build incredible cities like Dubai, right? And you can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, and you can live in Dubai. But at the same time, they're saying that this is still a Muslim country, but you as a Muslim are not allowed to drink alcohol, but there's still alcohol or cigarettes, tobacco in that city.
Yeah, but these are tiny, tiny countries. When I think of oil, I'm thinking of Arabia. And in that country, you can't even, not only can you not have a church, if Christians, laborers, Filipinos, meet or Indonesians or whatever, and they meet in a house and try to celebrate Christmas, they get arrested and tortured. Okay, so that's the primary. But I know Qatar and Dubai and these places are seen as Western friendly, and they are, but they're very, very tiny and uninfluential in that sense. It's really the heart of it all is Arabia, Saudi Arabia.
So. So Christians have the Bible, right? It's the holy book. So Protestants have 66 books in the Bible, Catholics and Orthodox 73 books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Deuteronomy, the extra or as they're called, Apocrypha books.
Yeah. So Muslims have the Quran. Mm-hmm. Jews have what? They have the Old
Pentateuch,
Testament, but they call it the Pentateuch, the Tanakh.
Yeah.
What's the Talmud?
The Talmud is, as I understand it, which comes much later after the diaspora and the destruction of the Second Temple, and it's these rabbinical writings and juridical writings about that arose in the circumstances of Jews now living in exile, because now it's with the destruction, as I understand, of the Second Temple, Judaism itself is destroyed because you need the temple
to do sacrifices.
Yeah. I mean, that's the understanding of traditional Judaism. And so with the destruction, Judaism sort of, I don't know if I want to use the word, but it's in a transitional phase or a temporary phase. And I believe that's the origin of the Talmud, which is basically dealing with and responding to new circumstances that are not covered in the context of having a temple, for example.
But not all Jews live according to the Talmud.
I don't believe so. No.
So we're Christians, right? So we live and we are waiting for the second coming of Jesus Christ. In the meantime, we have kids and love our neighbors and etc., right? So Muslims are waiting for the second coming of Jesus as well. Is that correct?
No, they're not waiting for the second coming of Jesus. He's just a part of the second coming, but he's not the culmination of the second coming. You have the war with the Dajjal. Okay, where I think even Jesus fights this, which we would call an antichrist figure, something like that. And depending on if it's a Sunni or Shia eschatology, end day understanding, they differ as well. But yeah, Jesus has a role, but it's not about Jesus. In the Christian understanding, Jesus is coming to rule and judge. In the Muslim understanding, yes, because they're trying to maintain that, they're trying to stick to the original narrative so they can seem legitimate. He's still part of it, but the reality, it just ends up with everyone being judged according to the teachings of Muhammad.
Okay, but if let's say you and me, we are Jews, so we are not waiting for Christ because we know that he lived. He's not a prophet. He's nobody to us. So we're waiting for the Messiah that will build the third temple.
Right.
So we could do sacrifices because now we're sinners, right?
Right.
So the third temple has to be built on that mount, only on that mount, no other place.
I'm not entirely sure, but that's what my understanding.
And you cannot build the third temple because there is a mosque
right there. Underneath it. Yeah. Or yeah.
Okay, so Christians and Muslims are friends, or foes? Christians and Muslims.
Are they friends or foes to each other?
Yes.
You mean
if you're a Christian?
Doctrinally, historically, contemporarily? Okay. To a Muslim, a Christian is a foe because he's a non-Muslim. Okay. Islam, the teachings are, the word kafir, okay, the word kafir means, if you look at a Quran today, and they translate it generally as unbeliever. So today they'll tell you kafir means non-Muslim, all right? And that is what it means. But the word itself is so full of negative connotations. Okay, to be a kafir is to essentially be an enemy of Islam, an enemy of Allah, an enemy of Muslims. You're like an animal. You're described as being a dumb brute, cow, beast. Okay, God wants to torture and terrorize you. So it's interesting because you read an English Quran translation and you just see the word unbeliever and you think it's neutral, but it's so full of these negative connotations. So I only bring that up because you're asking me, Christians and Jews or Christians and Muslims, are they friends? Well, from the Muslim point of view, if you read the Quran, if you read the Sunnah and the Hadith, no, they're not. Christians are enemies. So are Jews. So is everyone who's not a Muslim. I have a video I translated. I put it on my web or my YouTube a long time ago of an Egyptian cleric saying how Islamic law allows a Muslim man to marry a Christian woman or a Jewish woman, Ahl al-Kitab, but he says you have to hate her because Islam teaches you have to hate non-Muslims. So even if you're married to this woman who's a Christian or Jew, you can copulate with her and treat her as your wife, but you have to hate her and show her that you hate her. Okay.
But once she converts, she says that Muhammad is the
Sure, of course.
prophet.
If she converts, then she's good. You can love her. But as long as she doesn't, you can marry her and you can engage in sexual relations with her, but you have to hate her.
Yeah, but why is that just one man saying? If it's not mentioned the same
No, but his saying, it's not just one man saying, it's an actual teaching, and it comes from the Quran. The verse that I told you, for example, that it's Quran 64, which says the example for you as a Muslim is Abraham. And he said to his family, I hate you until you become Muslims. So that's the pivotal verse.
So to Christians, Muslims are friends or foes?
Historically, to Christians, Muslims were people who attacked them and stole their nations and conquered their lands.
Right now, you're a Christian. If you meet a Muslim, he's a friend or foe to you?
To me, if I meet a Muslim, so he's an individual human being who can have his own thoughts and his own beliefs, but I know the ideology that he is formally associated with, Islam, is hostile to me and hostile to my beliefs. I don't know to what degree he is aligned with this, and this is why you get moderate Muslims who, they call themselves Muslims, but they're good people and they don't think these things. I
knew a few of them.
Yeah, and they don't think these things. I get it. Okay, but that's but I don't know how they reconcile. I as a Christian can reconcile my beliefs with my Bible because it's not telling me to go conquer and kill. Okay, I don't know how they reconcile their peaceful beliefs, which I believe are true. But their book says otherwise. But that's also not that hard to understand. Today we live in a day and age where you have Christians and priests and pastors who believe that homosexuality is okay, correct, even though the Bible goes out of its way to condemn it, Old and New Testament. So people can believe whatever they want and they can associate themselves with a religion, but the religion is what the religion is.
Why are you a Christian?
Why am I a Christian?
Yes.
Well, I would probably be a Christian because I was born into it. That's the main reason, but I'm also convinced by it. The actual, I've taken the time to study it and look into it, and it's the most satisfying and intellectually satisfying, and not just intellectually, but it's the one that makes the most sense to me.
Is it fair to say that most of Muslims are Muslim just because they were born in the Middle East?
I would argue most people are whatever religion they are because they were born into it. Most people. Converts, whether it's an atheist or a Muslim who converts to Christianity, or a Christian or an atheist who converts to Islam, are very, very rare. Most people are actually in the religion that they were born into.
Is there anything that you don't like about the Christianity?
Well, I would have to ask you which Christianity.
Christianity, let's say Bible only, 66
Biblical book?
Yes.
Yeah, the Christianity. If you look at there's always what we call hard sayings, when you read the Bible, and just things that kind of don't make sense or seem strange. People will point to all sorts of things, especially in the Old Testament where I forget, which prophet is it who came out and all these children mocked him because he was bald, and so God had a bear come out and kill them all or something like that. So there's always these things that you come across in the Bible which, raise questions, and they're known as, hard sayings. And, as everyone else, I counter them and I try to figure them out and, try to rationalize them away. But by and large, the religion itself and its actual teachings the central core tenets, which should really matter, especially from a metaphysical point of view, I believe are very appealing and authentic to me.
So when people say that so you're a Christian, right? You believe in the Bible, you have to believe everything that is written in the Bible. And for instance, they take a few verses from the Deuteronomy or Leviticus. You have to stone gays, adulterers, and etc. And I'm always saying that's why you have to read the whole Bible, especially the New Testament, because when Jesus was born and he's teaching, he says, love your neighbor. What are the most important two commandments, right? Love your God and love your neighbor like yourself. So it means that you don't have to stone gays, adulterers, and etc. from now on, since Jesus has arrived.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's called the Old and the New Testament. There's a new covenant. The Old is, the one that would still govern the ancient Hebrews. That's how they lived. And, according to Christian teaching, that was what God wanted. But it's also understood, that was the time and place that sort of thing happened. But Jesus comes, and a lot of it, the spirit of it is still the same. So homosexuality is still bad, for example.
It's the same.
But now you don't have to stone them, okay? It's not for you to do that, let's say. But so in that sense, it hasn't changed. The sins are still the sins. But now there's this new covenant where there's forgiveness, there's tolerance, which doesn't mean you should accept it. Of course, I think it's still outlawed. Paul makes that very clear. It's an abomination. It's one of the Romans very clearly discusses sexual immorality and homosexuality. So in that sense, I don't think the New Testament and the Old Testament differ much. It's just about the punishments and the consequences. So right is still right and wrong is still wrong.
Is there anything that you like about Islam?
That I like about Islam?
Yeah.
I like the fact in Islam it's conservative and it's traditional. The stuff that we are suffering from in Western civilization, which is gender confusion, this wild rampant feminism, this emasculation of men, et cetera, which is very much, I think, being enforced on Western peoples, many of whom are Christian, at least in their background. I think that's very despicable. And to Muslims' credit, they don't really suffer from that sort of thing. Cool. So I give them that. That's a good thing. That doesn't necessarily, that's not a reflection of their pure theology. I think a lot of it is actually more cultural and has to do, with them being such old world people but if you bring a Muslim and you put them in the West for a few generations, they become the same. So they also get watered down. So I think it's less a reflection of Islam and less a reflection of Christianity and more to do with, these cultural and societal forces that are impacting both groups.
Would you say more Christians convert to Islam or more Muslims convert to Christianity?
That's a good question. If I had to think about it, and from what I've seen, I would argue more Muslims convert to Christianity because I follow a lot of Arabic media and I watch a lot of these shows. And the Christians who convert to Islam, they're usually limited to Europe. And they're disaffected with sort of this Western emasculation. A lot of them are in prison, in African Americans in prison. A lot of them come out Muslim for some reason. So I think, amongst Westerners, the only appeal is what I said, which is it's more of a masculine religion. But spiritually, when I watch a lot of these shows, and I've seen Muslims complaining about how many millions of Muslims are converting to Christianity, because of a lot of these polemical attacks on the religion of Muhammad. So it's really hard to say, but I do know I've heard for a fact Muslim clerics complaining about millions of Muslims converted to Christianity over the years, whereas I really don't know the number of European converts. I'm sure it's up there, but I don't know about many millions.
If nothing changes political wise in Europe, where do you see Europe in 2050?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that number because I believe I saw a Pew poll that said in 2050, something like Germany might be 40% Muslim. Okay. Yeah, it's amazing. Like if nothing changes and the birth rate of Muslims and the ongoing immigration and the fact that the Germans and Europeans in general have a low birth rate.
Very low.
Yeah. So, and this is what Muslims themselves call it. It's a demographic jihad, the jihad of the womb, which I mentioned, which is we're just going to take over by, outnumbering you and procreating. And then the state pays for it. That pays for all these children that are, the name Muhammad is the number one name in various European cities, which is just amazing. Imagine what other civilization. Imagine like in Mecca and Medina and in Cairo, the number one name is John. That is so inconceivable. Or even in India or in Hong Kong. But in the Western world, yeah.
Are you afraid of Islam? Generally?
Well, that's what Islamophobia means, right? Fear of Islam. Yeah, I suppose I would be afraid of Islam if who I am was thrown into the midst of Muslims. But I don't necessarily fear it in that sense, because I try not to put myself in that situation. But I'm wary of Islam, obviously, because I know what it teaches and how it feels about people like me who are non-Muslims. So Islamophobia, the irony about it, is it's supposed to be the word phobia, Greek word phobia, which means fear. Whenever people label someone having a phobia, they mean it's an irrational fear, right? So he's claustrophobia, right? Or agoraphobia, he's afraid of being in a public space, but it's irrational. In the case of Islam, yeah, we are Islamophobic. We do fear it, and it's rational to fear Islam because Islam makes clear that I'm the enemy.
What about other religions? Hinduism, with all their gods, like the gods of war, Kali?
Yeah, they have all that, and they would be considered from a Christian point of view pagans and polytheists. But they don't have a systematic theology of warfare the way Islam does. Islam is very unique in the sense all religions have just wars in Christianity, other forms of warfare in other religions, but Islam is unique in that it has this imperative holy war, jihad. It's the only religion that's like that.
How do you view when you see those videos from Israel when Jews spit on Christians?
How do I feel?
How do you view it?
Oh, how do I view it? Anti-Christians. They're not those particular Jews, and my understanding, thankfully, is that they're the minority. But they're obviously hostile and enemies to Christianity, to Christians.
Although we share the same Old Testament, they don't care.
Well, yeah, I mean, we share the same Old Testament, but historically, the divide between Jews and Christians is great. It revolves around the person of Christ. So in other words, the theme and the thing that makes Christians who they are is precisely what Jews reject, right? Muslims accept Jesus, but like I said, it's not the real Jesus, it's Isa. So they just want to use the name so they have some legitimacy. But then they present a completely different Jesus. But of course, historically, there's no way around it that Christians and Jews have been at odds, and it revolves around the person of Jesus.
So the last two questions, since I know that we're running out of time. So let's have two assumptions with you. Assumption number one is the President of the United States of America is the most powerful human being on planet Earth. Mm-hmm. Assumption number two is you become one. You become the President of the US, and you have the Secret Service at your disposal. They come to you and say, Mr. President, we love you, congratulations. We know all the answers in the world. You ask us, we give you an honest answer. What would be your first question? So what question, in other words, you're asking me, what question do I have if I know I'm going to get an absolutely honest answer to it? Correct. What would be the first? I know you've got lots of them.
The first question as President of the United States. Well, I think I already know the answer, but I would be, who's really in control of America and why, or not just America and Europe, why are these nations doing everything possible to hurt themselves? Whereas every other nation works for itself and helps itself and does what we would call selfish things. For example, why is it in Europe that the name Muhammad is the number one name, whereas this would never happen in another country? I'd be curious to know the answer.
Because we're more compassionate than they are.
That's the end. No, but you said they'd tell me the truth. That's the politically correct answer.
Yes.
I wanted the truth.
They just want to destroy themselves. God bless you, Raymond. So your books can be bought on Amazon?
Yeah, you can get them at Amazon. That's probably the easiest and I think even the least expensive place to get them.
And you've got the YouTube channel?
Yeah, and I have the new YouTube
Link
channel.
in the description below.
Yeah, Holy War.
God bless you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Apollo.